Again, kinetics is all about the rates of your chemical reactions. And the application is primarily adjusting parameters and see how your reaction rates change. Now, with regards to enzyme kinetics, this started in early 1900s, and one of the famous studies was done by Adrian Brown. He was someone who was working in the fermentation industry. So they were making malts, and they were studying the fermentation of sucrose by yeast. So Brown was able to isolate the agent that makes possible or that speeds up the reaction. So he studied this agent, and with his kinetics studies and observations, he was able to conclude that it is the enzyme substrate complex that is important in the catalytic action of enzymes, or basically in the ability of enzymes to speed up reactions. Now, before we go to the math of enzyme kinetics, there are some things that we need to keep in mind. So, when you studied chemical kinetics, you know that the concentration of a substrate affects the rate of a chemical reaction. So, if we have a system composed of enzymes and substrates, we know that as the reaction takes place, your substrate getting transformed to your products, the concentration of your substrate decreases. Hence, the rate of the reaction is also affected. So, as time passes by, the concentration of the substrate changes, so the reaction rate also changes. And this complicates things. But a workaround is consider that in your system, you only have very small amount of enzyme. Let's say 10 enzyme molecules. And you have a very, very large amount of your substrate. Let's say 100,000 substrate molecules. So if we measure the reaction rate for, let's say, 60 seconds or 40 seconds, only a very little portion of your substrate undergoes the reaction. So in essence, the amount or the concentration of your substrate remains the same. So this is what we call method of initial rates. Or in enzyme kinetics, instead of initial rate, they use the term initial velocity. So that is the setup. You have a very small concentration of your enzyme and a very large concentration of your substrate. Of course, you can change the concentration of your substrate and monitor the initial velocity of the reaction. And if you do so, you will get a plot like this. So at very low concentrations of your substrate, there is an almost linear trend. And as the concentration of the substrate increases, the degree of change in the initial velocity decreases until the graph plateaus. So this hyperbolic pattern that we observe is very classical of enzyme kinetics. Now, this maximum initial velocity that the plot approaches is what we call Vmax, or maximum initial velocity, and it is the maximum reaction rate possible for that given concentration of enzyme.